All right, can you please tell me about this picture?
Well, first of all, I'll say my name was Wilma Beck, and these are my Beck family. My grandparents in the middle. This is my father, and this is my Aunt Matilda, and this is my Uncle Bill. And all of them were born in Russia. I mean, those five. They came in 1905, and they had family in Campbell County, and that's where they stayed for a few years. And my grandma was pregnant on the way, and Lydia, that's Lydia right there, and she was born right after they got here. And my grandma said one time, and I wasn't seasick. Well, then they lived in Campbell County for a few years, and then they moved to a farm about 7 miles north of Eureka, and that's where they stayed until they were quite old, and then they lived in town for a while until they died. And one of my cousins is still living on that farm. And then all of these, the rest of these people were born in this country. You want to go to the next picture?
Sure.
Okay. Now this is the older generation. These two people, I should say the father, that's the father of my grandfather. And both of them were named John or Johannes. And this is another picture. There were, how shall I say this? That was my great-grandfather, and this, I believe, was my grandfather. And these two people were brother and sister of my grandfather, and this was the husband of this woman. And then the first mother died, and then there was another mother, and she was the mother of Edward. So he was like a half-brother to my grandpa. And then he married one more time, and that was the woman that came to this country, and I knew her. She ended her life in the Lutheran home here. And these people are my brother, my father, my Uncle Bill or William, my Aunt Matilda. These are the three that came from Russia. And this is Lydia, who was born right after they came to America.
You mentioned knowing the woman who came over. Can you
Yes,
tell me
they
any
lived in
memories?
Ardis. And this Edward, he and his family lived at Ardis too, and there are still some of his family living there on the farm. And we used to go to visit them, and this old grandma was living in town in Ardis, and we would take her along and go to Edward's house for the evening. And then I remember when she died sometimes, probably in the 40s. Okay, this is another family picture. It's a more recent one. It was probably taken around 1940. Those are my parents right there, my grandparents, Aunt Matilda and her husband, Jacob, Joachim, and the Stabels, Emil Beck and Frida, William Beck and Margaret, Arthur Retzer and Helen, and that's Emma. She was not married at the time. This is Paul Hausauer and Aunt Lydia, and Ben Beck and Catherine. And they have all died except Frida. She lives in the Ashley nursing home. She's 90.
Was this taken for a special occasion?
I think they just wanted a family picture, another one where the spouses were on. Okay, that's my parents and their kids. I didn't have a sister. These two guys are a lot younger than I am, and this is Marvin, Gideon, Gordon, and Delbert. And Marvin passed away quite a while ago. Gideon lives here in town. Delbert lives in Rapid City, and Gordon lives in Sioux Falls. My father died in 1953. That's a long time. He had a heart condition. And my mother died in 1991. She lived here in town for many years, all the while when she was a widow.
Can you tell me what kind of person your mother was?
Everybody liked my mother. She was Aunt Ida to everybody. And one of my cousins that also works on genealogy, she wrote this in one of her letters one time. She said, Aunt Ida was the only person I knew that could write with a German accent. That sounds funny, doesn't it? She never remarried. She lived over here on the east side of town. She always had a big garden. She did a lot of quilting. She and her neighbors had kind of a thing going where people would bring them quilts and they finished them, quilted them by hand. She worked in the bakery for a number of years. My aunt and her husband had the bakery, and they would start working on Friday evening and work all night. Then she traveled a lot. She had two sisters that liked to travel, and she went with them, and every summer they went somewhere. They went all the way to the East Coast. They went to California and to the Grand Canyon and went to Washington because we had another aunt in Washington State, and she enjoyed that. And she spent her last years in the nursing home.
Right. What kind of person was your father?
He was not a very outspoken person. He had kind of a soft voice, and he had a lot of friends, and he was a farmer, of course, and then about that time, a couple of years before he died, they moved to town, and my brother took over the farm. But the reason they moved to town was because my father wasn't well. And they had so little education. And my mother talked about that sometimes, and how she liked the teachers, and the teachers usually boarded at her parents' home, and there were so many times when they couldn't go to school because they came from such large families, and my mother was one of the oldest ones, and my dad was the oldest one too in the family. And my mother and her sister had to stay home to help do the laundry and take care of the little kids and help with the butchering and all that stuff, so they just didn't get much schooling. But one thing I always noticed about my father and my grandfather, that they had common sense, and they could figure things out, like how much this animal weighed and how much wheat you were going to get off of this field, and I thought they were especially good with figures. But I remember sometimes when my dad had to write something, and then he would ask us how to spell it, because he just didn't learn much. But my grandfather was, he was very busy in church, and he was a deacon for a long time. And then later my dad was a deacon, and the pastor didn't always come to church, to our country church every Sunday, so the Sundays in between, the deacon would read a sermon and conduct the service. And my grandpa did that, and my father also. So they were very active in that way.
All right, can you tell me about this picture?
That is my father, Gustav Beck, and his sister, Matilda. And it looks like it's Matilda's confirmation, but my dad was confirmed earlier, and that was while they lived in Campbell County. And I guess they didn't have a picture of him, so they put him on this picture. And this is Matilda and her husband, Jacob Joachim. He was a World War I veteran, and their children, Hildegard and Milbert, and they have all passed away. And this is Matilda again, and my grandmother, Emilia Beck, and Hildegard, the same girl as this, and her first child, who is Donna Haupt, and now her name is Gol. And she's, I keep very close to her. She always sends me letters and cards and things. And it so happens that Hildegard and I married brothers. So she was my cousin and my sister-in-law. Next. And that's Hildegard and Otto Haupt. She's my cousin and sister-in-law, and it was my husband's brother. You can turn that. And this is Milbert, the son of the family, and his wife, Frances. Milbert has died, but Frances lives in Washington State. Their home was in Artis, South Dakota. That's my Uncle William Beck, who was also born in Russia, and his wife, Margaret, and her family name was Kammerer. And the picture below is from their 25th anniversary. And that's their family picture. They had 3 girls, the daughters, and this daughter in the middle died in a car accident, and the other 2 are still living.
Were you close to this family growing up?
Yes, they lived northeast of Eureka, and those were the days when you did a lot of visiting and went to the same church, and we knew all of them real well. Margaret just died a few years ago. That's okay, you can turn that. Is there something on the back, or did we do that? Oh, we did that. And that's again Bill and Margaret and their 3 daughters. And this is one of the girls in her wedding, and that's one of the girls when they were little. And those are their 3 daughters. Those are all confirmation pictures. That one lives in California, and this one lives in Aberdeen. Her first husband died, and she has remarried, and this is the one that died in the car accident. And she has 3 children living. Okay. And that's the oldest daughter, Bernice, and her husband, Harold Rohrbach. They live in California. And that's Betty, the youngest daughter. And that's Lydia and Paul Hausauer. She's the one that was born right after they came to this country, and their home was about 5 miles north of Eureka, so we all lived so close together, and that's why we knew all of our cousins so well and got together a couple of times a year.
Do you have any particular memories of Lydia?
Well, on Sunday we would go to visit him, and then she always cooked supper for us, and she was a real gentle person, not real outspoken. She was a nice lady. And Paul was, he was kind of a leader in the community. He worked with He worked with REA for a long time, when REA was established around here. They had one daughter. Go ahead. That's their daughter and her husband, Bob Jones. And they live here in Eureka. Paul and Lydia have passed away. Alice and Bob live in Eureka. And that's her wedding picture, Alice and Bob.
Can you tell me what a typical wedding was like when you were growing up?
Well, this was, this was in the 50s, I suppose. They were married in the Congregational Church, and then they had a reception at their farm north of Eureka. And, they'd make a big dinner for everybody, and it was fun. Weddings changed, too, through the years. My wedding reception was at the farmhouse, too, but then later on, they started having a reception at the country club building. But you had to bring all your own equipment to serve dinner and whatever. And she has 2 sons. That's one of the sons. And this, I think, is Lydia's confirmation picture. I don't know where I got all these confirmation pictures. Somebody must have given them to me. And that's Alice again. Wasn't there something on the back of that one? No. This is Helen. She's also my dad's sister. And she married Arthur Retzer, and I really don't have a better picture of him. This is also a confirmation picture, and this, I don't know how old she was there, but she was pretty. And that other one there was long after she was married, this one. She was sick a lot. I don't know what her illness was, but when they were young, we didn't have doctors like we do now that can figure everything out. And she was laid up a lot. Sometimes I even went to her place once when I was a teenager to help her take care of the house. And she was in bed a lot. She was just miserable. And she died. She was only about 40 when she died. And she had 4 children. And that's her oldest daughter. She's a few years younger than I. She lives in Minneapolis now.
And what's her name?
Genevieve. Genevieve Retzer Opp, O-P-P.
Do you remember spending a lot of time with her when you were growing up?
Well, not as much as some of the other ones, because their home was in South Dakota, but closer to Ashley. And, it was a funny thing, but it was a long ways to go there. It was probably about 15 or 20 miles. But they had a farm up there on the north side of McPherson County, but then after she died, they gave up the farm, and her husband died a few years later. And those are the Stabels. That's my dad's sister, Pauline. Arthur and Pauline Stabel. And they lived north of Eureka too, but a little farther west. And they had 2 daughters and several infant children that died. And she had a home here in Eureka after her husband died, and then they noticed that she was seemed like Alzheimer's, you know. And then her daughter took her along to Minneapolis, and she was over there, I think that was close to 15 years, and her daughter took care of her all that time, and she died just maybe 2 years ago. Truly a nice lady. And that's her family and her. This is Ardella Bennett, the one I talked about that has all the genealogy stuff.
And the other daughter's name?
The other daughter's name is Marcella Lemon. They have a home in Minnesota and go to Arizona in the wintertime. And Art passed away a long time ago. Those are the two daughters at the top. This one and this one are the same one. That's the mother's confirmation picture. Ardella lives in Minneapolis.
Do you have any memories of spending time with these?
Yeah, we would go to their place to visit, and they came to our place to visit, and when we were kids we ran around outside and explored everything, and the mothers always cooked supper for everybody, and we had, like at Thanksgiving, we'd all get together at the grandma's house, and everybody brought a roaster with something good in it, or a cake or something. We got together a lot. Oh, there was another thing. My grandfather's birthday, John Beck, it was on July 10th. Why do I remember that? And no matter if it was harvest season or whatever, the whole family came home that night, and we made homemade ice cream and stuff, and the minister came out, and then we'd all go in the living room and sang a few songs, and his wife played the organ, and he talked a little bit like ministers do, and that's a good memory I have. We always got together on Grandpa Beck's birthday. That was on the farm. Can't remember if we got together when they were in town. That's Ardella Bennett. Ardella Strobel Bennett. That's my Aunt Pauline, and this is Ardella, and this is Ardella's daughter. And this is Pauline again with her granddaughters. And this is Marcella and her husband, Dwayne Lemon, and their two daughters. That's Emma, my dad's sister, and her husband, John Schmidt. She married late in life, and they have both died. She did a lot of odd jobs in town before she married, worked in the hospital laundry and things like that, and her husband was an electrician. And she had a lot of flowers. When she came to my house, she always brought something, either a plant or a new towel or something. That's Emma, too.
Do you remember spending a lot of time with her when you were
Yes.
growing up?
And well, the grandparents still lived on the farm, and you know, I was like 14 or whatever, and my brother was 2 years older, and I don't know how much older she was, but in harvest time we went out to shock together. Do you know what it is to shock grain? grain bundles that you cut with the binder, and then you had to shock them. That meant you put about 8 bundles together to stand up so they would dry. And you always had to put the stem on the ground, and the heads had to be up here, and you tried to set them up so the wind wouldn't blow them over. And she talked a lot. She taught us a lot of stuff. She talked and talked all the time, and that was fun. She could sew, and she always remodeled her dresses like this thing. She probably took that off a different dress and put it on here, and then 2 weeks later she put something else on. She was always remodeling her dresses. We looked at that. That's Benjamin, my dad's brother, and Catherine, and her name was Wolff, like my mother, and she was my mother's cousin. They lived on the family farm after the grandparents, and at one time they had 2 houses there, and the grandparents lived in one and they lived in the other one, and it's their son that still lives on that farm. And that's Benny and Catherine and their kids. He's the one that lives on the farm, and this one, he doesn't have a family. This one lives in Colorado, and he has several adult children, and she was a nurse, and she lives in someplace in Michigan, and her husband was a teacher in a college, I guess, and they're retired now, and she has 2 children and some grandchildren. And that's Benny and Catherine again.
Do you remember spending a lot of time with this family?
Oh, yes.
Growing up?
Being that she was so close to my mother, and we lived less than a mile apart. I mean, my parents and they, of course, I lived there too. We spent a lot of time with them.
Do you have any specific memories of these 2?
I guess they would all be work memories. No, not really. Later on, they celebrated their 50th anniversary and I think their 60th, and family always got together. I'm still close to their daughter. She calls me once in a while, and okay, you can take it. I think there's some more. Those are their kids. He's over 70 now, so that tells you how old we are. That's the daughter, Amanda. His name is Brown. And that's Amanda, and this is Alfred, the younger son. Waldemar didn't go to high school, so I guess he hasn't got a graduation picture. The kids that are older than I am, that grew up on the farm, most of them didn't go to high school. My older brother, well, both of my brothers, the older ones didn't go to high school. But then the younger ones, well, by that time, my parents had moved to town, so they went to high school. But that's about the time when it changed, when almost everybody started going to high school. That's my dad's youngest brother. My dad was the oldest and he was the youngest. And that's his wife Frida, and she's the one that's still living in the Ashley nursing home.
And what was his name?
Emil. They have a son, I guess he lives in Denver or someplace, and the daughter lives in Ashley. That's why they decided to go to Ashley. And that's their family too.
What are the names of their children?
Sonia and John. And they have 2 children. No, she has 3 children, I think. And he's got 2 children. There's a picture of them too. And that's Emil and Frida and their children again. And this is Sonia and her husband. His name is Stanley Schnabel. And they run that, I don't know, is it still a co-op station where they sell gas and other stuff beside the highway in Ashley? And that's John. But there was another picture. Must be in a different book.
All right, can you tell me about this picture?
I'll start at the beginning. My grandfather was Jacob Wolff, and he came to this country in 1885 when he was about 8 years old. And they took a land claim. It's also about 7.5 miles north of Eureka, but it's a little farther west. All these things were very close together. And he lived with his parents, and his father was only here 10 years till he died. And then his mother lived a few years longer, and it turned out that she had breast cancer, and of course, you can imagine there was no help for it in those days. And she had, I'll get to the next picture, she had 6 sons, but no, just turn it over, no daughters. And one of those sons took care of her till she died, and she died before 1900. And then, that's my grandfather right there, and the other ones are his brothers. These 5 came from Russia, and this one was born here. And then he went about a mile north, and he got his own land there, and that's where this house is. And here they already have 7 children, and they had 7 more after that. I remember this building. Later on, when they built a bigger house, they called this the summer kitchen. You know what a summer kitchen was? You cooked there in the summertime. I think that was to keep the big house clean and cooler. And of course, then you did all the butchering in there and all that stuff. And then in the fall, you just cleaned it up and shut it down for the winter. I was told that, oh, I wasn't supposed to move that. Excuse me. The man on the left was the hired man, and the boy beside him was the oldest son, Jacob. And then there's 2 more kids in between there, and one on the chair, which was probably my Aunt Mary. The lady, of course, was Grandma. And the next girl looks taller. That was my mother. And then there's another little one, and then over here this was probably Christine beside Grandpa. But that tall girl there in the middle was probably my mother. Well, then let's look at some of the other ones. Now this is a view from, they're standing way out east and looking west, and here you see that same house way over there. And when they built this big house, it was right about in there. And here you see a lot of horses. And that was something I was going to tell you about. All these places are along Spring Creek, which is the same creek that runs over to Pollock, South Dakota, and runs in the Owyhee. And there are a lot of springs. And they say it happened in 1903. They wanted to make a well, and then when they got down farther, they got into one of these springs, and it had a terrific force. They said it kept washing all the ground away. Can you give me those little pictures over there? And you know that well is still there. This is the best picture of it. You see it right back there, that little thing there. There's kind of a mound. What they did was they made a mound, to try and contain that water because it kept tearing the ground away. It was such a strong force in that spring. And then they dumped rocks into it, try to slow it down, and then they made this big mound, and then on top of it was the opening for the well, and then it finally settled down. And that well is still there. And after my grandpa moved to town in the 30s, then one of my uncles lived there, and he died in the 40s. And then my brother bought the farm, and he lived there till, gosh, I can't remember when they went to town, about, I suppose, in the 90s. And now they sold the farm, there's somebody else living there, and that well is still working. That's really amazing. And then that's the new house that was built in 1916. And that had a bathroom, and it had electricity. They had something called a Delco plant, a motor that produced power for the lights and stuff. The water system wasn't that great, but it still is a nice house. It has always been well kept. It doesn't look like this anymore because they had to remove these porches. See, this was a porch and this was a balcony. But that the floors got bad. They should have been replaced, and a big porch like that costs a lot to keep up, even the paint. And then they took it all away and put down just some steps to go into the house. So that picture, that's my grandpa and his youngest daughter, and they always told me it was taken in California, but that's all I know. My grandpa did go someplace once in a while. This is the picture of the family when they came to America in 1885. When kid was little, I think that one is my grandpa. And they died before 1900. They weren't here very long. Okay, turn it over. Unless you have some questions.
Is this one same thing?
That's the same picture, that's just a close-up.
Okay.
Those, of course, were copied. And that's my grandpa and grandma. It was the style to have your picture taken, and then they put them in these big frames, and I've got two of them in there. They would be hanging in the living room.
Do you remember them very well?
Oh yes, I spent lots and lots of time with them, and then they moved to town. Their house was not very far from here, and when I went to high school, I spent a lot of time there, and Grandma was a good cook, and Grandpa had a big garden, and then he died in the early 40s. Everybody in this family has cancer. I've had cancer too. My great-grandmother, my grandfather, my mother, and I, we've all had cancer. And There were 14 kids in that family, and they have all died except one now, and I would say at least half of them died of cancer, including my mother. That's really weird.
What other memories do you have of your grandparents?
Well, when we were little, see, we lived so close to them, and my mother had all these sisters, and they were always taking care of us, and they just dumped us there. They were the automatic babysitters or whatever. And we would walk up there to their place. It was less than a mile, and the school was between our place and their place, and the teachers usually stayed at their place. I have lots of memories of them. Grandma would go out in the morning, see that those girls, most of them didn't go to high school either, and then once they were out of grade school, they were just available. And the flowing well I was talking about, Grandma would go out in the morning and pull the plug and let a whole tank full of water into the garden. It flowed downhill, and they had a huge garden, so they always had lots of vegetables and stuff, and then the tank filled again during the day. And Grandpa was interested in a lot of things like planting trees and okay, you can take that.
Just a second. You mentioned she was a good cook. What were some of the things she made for you?
Well, a lot of this German cooking has come back. And when I went to high school, I remember she made Käsknäpfle. We call it cheese buttons. You roll out the dough and put a cottage cheese in and fold it up, and then you cook it in water. Then you can fry it in butter if you want to. And she always cooked that. And of course, they baked all their bread in those days and made kuchen and cookies and all kinds of meat, and everybody had chickens and ducks and stuff to dress and roast. And she lived to be 91, I think. Grandpa wasn't that old.
Right.
And that is my great-grandma Gold. Now, she would be the mother to that lady. That lady was Christina, and this woman was her mother. And she sometimes lived at their house when she was a widow. These kids are some of her grandchildren from a different family. They're not from our family. And she's buried in the Wolff cemetery too. If you want to go to see anything, maybe you'd want to see the Wolff cemetery. It's a special place to me. Okay, this is when Grandma was in the nursing home, and you know she had that hairstyle all her life. When she combed her hair, she put her head way down. You know, she was standing, and then the hair would hang down to here, and then she twisted it, and then she laid it up here, and that's the way her hair always was. These are some of her lady friends. I remember them too. And this lady, this was in the nursing home, and this lady's name was also Wolff, and she was blind. And I was wondering about that one day, if they would still allow that in the nursing home. They had a little paring knife in their drawer, and then they always wanted strange stuff like a raw cucumber, and so we would give them that, and she sat there with her blind eyes and her paring knife and peeled the cucumber. I don't think they'd allow that anymore. And that's my mother and her mother.
Okay.
And that's Grandpa and Grandma Wolff. Jakob and Christina. See, there's her bun up there.
What kind of a person was your grandfather?
He was he was a good guy. I don't remember that he ever scolded us or got mad, but you know, in those days, kids were for working, and you know, as soon as they were old enough to do something, my mother had to help in the field too, but she never complained. You know, he would sit down at the dining room table and open the Bible history with the pictures in it, and then he told us the stories and pointed out what was on the pictures. And then he would go to Greenway with the wagon and I suppose take a load of wheat up, but the kids had to load the wheat on the wagon before. He didn't do that. And then he'd come home with a package wrapped in white paper, and I told my cousins this when we had a reunion, he brought halva. Do you know what halva is? Well, I can't explain it. It's something kind of sweet, and I love to eat it, but my kids laugh at me. I don't even know what it's made out of, but they still have it at the grocery store. And he would cut it in little cubes and give us some of that. That's why I liked it so much, I think. He was very anxious to get a lot of land. You know, people homesteaded and then they would sell it or lose it for taxes or something, and he always bought up this land, and he put all of his boys on farms when they got married, and the girls all got 80 acres, I think, of land. So he had a lot of land by the time he quit. And my mother said he didn't care that much about buying clothes and stuff for you. You had to make do, but he liked to buy land.
Right. Can you tell me a little more about your grandmother?
Well, she was quite outspoken. They always tell this story about when some of the kids were, well, I suppose they only had a few kids at that time, and then my grandpa went to Texas with somebody. And when he came back, he was all fired up. He wanted to move to Texas. And Grandma said, "You can go, the kids and I are staying." So she had some pressure there. She could get her way too if she wanted it. That's my mother, and those are all her sisters. And then I found this picture the other day. Those are the brothers. But see, one brother died. They had a brother, Herbert. He must have been about in the middle of those four. And when he was 20 years old, he had a ruptured appendix, and there was no hospital here, and they took him to Aberdeen, and he didn't survive. And he's buried in that Wolff cemetery, too. That was a big loss.
Do you remember spending a lot of time with any of these people?
Well, this is the youngest one. She was born in 19, so she was only 6 years older than me. And we spent a lot of time playing together. These two, you know, we had a college over here. I don't know if you ever heard about it. It was right over here. That was built about in 1910. It was kind of connected with the Lutheran Church, and it went on until the 30s, and then they had to close it because there wasn't enough money around. And those two girls, see, it was like an academy where they took their high school and had 2 years of college. And that's where those two girls went. And they became teachers and taught school for a long time. This is the oldest sister. She's older than my mother. This one is still living, but she doesn't know it. She's down there in the nursing home, and she hasn't talked for a number of years, and I used to be close to her. She lived in one of these apartments for a while, and she always invited me over for lunch and stuff like that. And she's the one that had the bakery, she and her husband, that my mother worked for. But, you know, I just saw her the other day. You have to ask yourself, why do people have to live like that? They have her laying in a big recliner and they put food in her mouth and she eats it. She was 92 last month, I think. This aunt died not too long ago. They moved to Washington State in the 30s, and they were apple pickers, and they ended up owning the orchard. But I said their kids didn't pick apples, they worked for Boeing. And I have gotten to know their kids, at least two of them, quite well. And this uncle died when he was 36. He also had cancer. And this uncle moved to, he was the oldest, and he moved to Washington State. They never said much about him. He came to visit once in a great while, and we visited him one time in Yakima, Washington. I don't think he could farm. He wasn't successful as a farmer, and I think I'm imagining some of these things that my grandpa sent him to Washington State because there were some other relatives there, and they had a good life there, you know, just working in orchards and all kinds of stuff. I guess they were the immigrant workers of the day, or whatever you would call them.
All right, can you tell me about this picture?
Do you want me to name them all? That takes kind of a long time. This one is my mother, and the others are her sisters, their husbands, and her sisters-in-law.
And when was this taken?
I think it said 88 on the back, didn't it? Let's see, I was going to say, there's only one of these living yet, and that's Elma, the one I said was in the nursing home, this one right there. She's the only one left of the whole family. These are confirmation pictures, but the one on the left is my Uncle Ferdinand, and the other one is my mother, but it wasn't her confirmation, just his. And this picture is my Uncle Herbert and my Aunt Mary. And Herbert was the one who died when he was 20. But it looks like it was confirmation for both of them. The top left is my mother, Ida, and her sister, Christina, and it says 1915. These are all confirmation pictures. The one to the right is the same one we just looked at, Herbert and Mary. The one on the lower left is Martha. And when you were confirmed, you got that nice new songbook. You had to take that to church every Sunday. And this one is Alma, the one that's still living. And you know, after she didn't wear that dress anymore, she gave it to me, and I used to wear that to church.
Did they make their dresses, or did they buy them?
These were not made, I'm sure. I don't know about my mother's. It looks pretty fancy. It's got a lot of lace on it and stuff.
Right.
Now we come to the wedding pictures. That is Jake Wolff, and her name was Mary Nies. And they got married in 1920. My mother's brother.
Were you close to their family growing
They're
up?
the ones that moved to Washington State, and they had 3 kids that were all born here, and then they moved away, and I don't even remember when they moved away. So I only saw them a few times in my life.
Okay.
That's their family. His name was Irvin, and this one was named Melbert, and that was Dina and Jackie. And they have all died. And that's Aunt Christina, mother's sister, and her husband George Rohrbach, and their children. She's the oldest. Well, I don't know about those other ones. She's one of the oldest cousins. She's older than I am. She lives in Aberdeen.
So were you close to this family growing up?
Well, sort of. They lived closer to Long Lake and on a farm, and we went over there and did the usual things, ran around all over and inspected everything, and they were all hard-working people. Everybody had to learn to work early in life, and those are the same people again. That's their daughter, that's their son, and this is the 2 oldest kids when they were little. And that must have been 25th anniversary or something.
Okay.
And that's one of their daughters. Her name is Meta, and her husband Eugene Graf. And that's the same couple. I don't know, I suppose they didn't have a wedding picture, but this is a real old picture of them. And that's Mother's brother, Theodore Wolff, and his wife, Christina. Her family name was Ottmer. And they had 2 children. I didn't put my mother's picture in there. I guess I put it in the Beck book and didn't put it into this one. Those are my parents.
A wedding picture?
That's a wedding picture. She always tells the story about she made her wedding dress, but she wanted a white dress, but one day she and her mother went to town to buy material, and then there was another lady there that had a big mouth, and she said, "Why do you want to have a white dress? That's not practical. Get a dark dress and then you can wear it more." And so they ended up having a blue dress.
And she made it herself?
She said she made it.
Do you know how your parents met?
Well, they were neighbors. And I told you they lived on both sides of us, and they used to tell you how they. I should give you that tape. It's in there someplace. Maybe you'd want to copy that. It's a tape I made of my mother, and I asked them what they did for entertainment, and she said on Sundays they always went someplace, but they had a walk. So they sometimes walked like 3-4 miles to the neighbors. And one of my friends made this funny comment about everybody married around the kitchen because, nobody couldn't go very far, so you married somebody who was convenient. And so, that whole neighborhood out there, they all married each other. This couple, they only lived a few miles apart, and It worked.
All right.
That's Ted again and his wife. Those are the same people in that picture. This one and this one were their kids. He lives in Long Lake now. He has lived in other places, and now they're running the restaurant over there. And that's their daughter when she got married. Gladys Wolff. And she married Julius Keese. But later on she married somebody else. And this is my brother, and this is my brother, and this is my cousin. I don't even know her name. Tells you how long it is. He's over 70, so it tells you how old the picture is. I believe this was at somebody's wedding anniversary. That's my grandmother and her two sons and their wives. And they're from the next family now. Quentin Wolff, he lives on a farm at Long Lake. And I think he's retired too, but he's the son of Ferdinand Wolff. That should come up next. And those are all kids of Ferdinand Wolff's. That must have been their 25th anniversary. Well, where's the parents' wedding picture? That's coming up. That was their 50th anniversary, and here we're in the church basement, we're all eating. That's Ferdinand Wolff, my mother's brother, and his wife was Magdalena Kammerer. My mother's brother married a Kammerer, and my dad's brother married a Kammerer. So that's what I mean, they kept it all in the family.
Were you close to this family growing up?
Yes. We visited together a lot. They lived farther east. It must have been about 10 miles maybe. But we visited a lot. And this was a double wedding. They're both my mother's sisters. Emma and Otto Opp and Magdalena and Gottlieb Hoffmann.
A double wedding? A double wedding?
Look at their flowers. They've got irises and whatnot in there. Looks like there's a few button ones, maybe some carnations. And I remember that. That was in 1931. Good heavens, I was 6 years old. I always ask people, do I remember correctly? Was there a thunderstorm that night? And they said yes. And the reception was at my grandparents' house.
Do you remember anything else about that wedding?
Not really. It must have been in our little country church. And you know, things weren't catered in those days. The sisters had to get in the kitchen and do all the cooking and fixing, and there must have been a lot of people there because they both had big families. I mean, the men too, they had big families.
Okay.
And that's Maggie's family, the one on that picture, the Huffmans.
Okay.
Their kids live in California, most of them. The parents have died. And that's the daughter, Darvella. They live in California too. And those are the two girls in the family, Myra and Darvella. And those are all of the same family too.
Okay.
They had a 90th birthday party for their dad. That was the two girls and their dad. I don't have to open that. And those are the children of the Upps, the other lady that was on the double wedding. First they had 5 girls and then they had some boys. She had 11 living children. Those are also from the same family. And that too, that's Janice Upp, and she married Maurice Junt. She's one of the 11. They're from the same family too. And that's Otto and his wife Bertha, and he died when he was 36, and she died a few years later, and they have 3 children, and their oldest son, well, they had 1 son and 2 girls, and their son died last year on New Year's Day, and he lived in Maryland. He was well educated and whatever. And that's the daughter, that's their daughter, that's their daughter. It must be the sun, but you can't see it very good.
Okay.
They're all from that family too. She's the one that's keeping the Wolff books now, the Wolff history books. She and her husband her husband does a lot of stuff, and he's not related to the Wolffs, but he has done a lot for those records. That's Roger.
And who's Roger?
Roger is the one I just mentioned that died last year. He had a degree in, what do you call it when you go around studying groundwater and rocks and stuff?
Geology?
Geology.
Okay.
And he ended up having a Christmas tree farm in Maryland. That's what he did when he quit his other job. And that's Elaine, his sister, and those are all their kids. That's Elaine and her husband. Their name is also Junt.
Okay.
Those are their parents, Otto and Bertha Wolff. And that's Frida, mother's sister, Frida and Theodore Martel. They had 2 children, but they died in infancy. They didn't raise any children. They were school teachers, and then they had a store in Long Lake and did a lot of stuff. It's funny how everybody started on the farm, and now there's nobody on the farm. My son and one of my cousins, I think. It's just, I have so many cousins, and I don't know if there's 3 of them on the farm. It's different. And that's Martha. Those men were brothers. Martha Martel. They're the 2 that were teachers. She was a teacher the longest, and eventually by going to summer school and stuff, she got a degree, in college. She caught up on that. She started with 1 year of college and taught school. Then she went another year, and then she took other courses, and she eventually had a degree. And those are all pictures of her and their wedding pictures. And those are Esther's kids, the youngest daughter. I just read something about him in the paper the other day. He's a lawyer in Sioux Falls, and I ran across his name in a paper. He's about 60. I think he's a little younger than my son. But they had 6 kids. There's another one coming up someplace. That's Esther and Mel Dybert. And these are all their kids. They had 6 children. That's their family. I don't know if you can't see it if you take a picture of that. It's too fuzzy. I can pick some of them out, but must have been their 50th anniversary or something. And that again is their wedding picture. There's my grandma with Esther and some of her kids. And that's my Aunt Mary and Carl Nies, the ones that lived in Washington State. Isn't that a pretty hairdo? I wonder how they did that. And that's the same couple.
Okay. They have any children?
Yes, they had 4. This is their oldest son. 2 of them were born here, then they went to Washington. They had 2 more kids, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And those men are close to my daughter now. My daughter lives in California, and they come to California for the winter for 2 months, and they've gotten close and have a lot of fun together. That's their daughter too. This was their house. We were there one time in the early 50s. It was outside of Yakima, Washington, where they had their orchard. That's the house they lived in. Those up there were their grandchildren.
Okay.
No, I haven't got any pictures in here of Elma, but that's all right. There's another book, but I don't want to get that out. This I thought was interesting. Well, let's look at this one. These were my cousins in 1938, but I got a lot more cousins after that.
Is this on your mom's side?
Hmm?
Is this on your mother's side?
Yeah. That's me in the corner with the hair hanging in my eyes. The littlest kids on that picture are probably in their 70s now, so you know how. At one time, my grandpa and aunts and uncles wanted to go to Washington to visit the brothers that were over there. And they left with 2 cars. They were probably 1929 Ford Model A's. And on the back it says it's at Marsh, Montana. They knew some people at Marsh, Montana. They are Raislers, and that was my great-grandmother's name, so they must have been relatives. So can you imagine, what would you do if 2 cars full of people came and said, can we stay here overnight? and they said they let them sleep there. I don't know where they slept, but they did, and they fed them. So then the next day they continued to Yakima, Washington. And the man with the hat is my grandpa. Oh, I'm moving it now. And these 3 people, this girl and these people, are the people they stayed with. And all these other ones are family, except that one lady and 2 kids. And the first 2 people here are Mary and Carl Nies, who ended up living in Washington. So that was funny.
This is your husband's family?
Mm-hmm. The boys are Edwin, Emanuel, and Otto. Emanuel, the one in the middle, is my husband.
Okay.
Maybe you want a picture of this. This is their wedding picture. It's not a very good picture. He was in the army for a short time in 1918 or 19.
And who is that?
That's Gustav Haupt. You know, the funny thing is he came to this country in 1912 and he wasn't a citizen yet, and he had to go to the army.
That is strange.
These are Gustav's parents. Let me look at this. I'm losing it. Christian Haupt. His name was Christian Haupt, and her name was Ernestine Schwab. Anyway, Christian and Ernestine Haupt, and they were my husband's grandparents, but he never met them. And these pictures are of relatives that didn't come to America, but they lived in Poland. And this man's name, this is Gustav, my father-in-law, and this is Albert. That's the one that came with him. They were very poor, and they had an uncle in Venturia, and he kept urging them to send some of their boys over here, and he paid their trip. And they came in about 1912. And they never went back, and they heard from their parents until 1939. And the father died in 1937, and then there were still a couple of letters, and then the mother said, "It looks like there's going to be war." That's what it said in the letter. And that was the last letter that ever came. And then they never had any contact anymore. And remind me to show you what those letters look like. They're written in German script. There's something in there about some of the things they do at the conventions, and there's a word for that, and I always wonder if that's what it means, of that German script. And my parents or my grandparents and my mother, they could write that too. I even know a little of it. We've been trying to translate letters, and sometimes there's one other picture I was going to show you in here. Can you pull that over? Get a picture of this. That is, those are Emanuel's great-grandparents, and their names are Franz, they called it Franz, F-R-A-N-Z, Weissenberger, and the mother's name was Maria Pfeifle. There's a lot of Pfeifles involved here. And I believe that they were some of the first people that came to this area. Do you know how to spell that, Weissenberger? It's on there. And this is that cemetery I mentioned earlier. It's farther east from where we lived. And some of these people are buried here. I think they are too. And this side was kind of open, but there was some more to it over here. And it was, somebody had planted some chokecherry trees in there, and eventually it was just a mess. And then we got together with some other people and cleaned out some of it. So actually now it's a fairly nice cemetery. That's the one where I said we put the telephone wire around so it wouldn't catch the thistles. Okay. Are you done? What else were we going to do with this here?
These pictures. I don't know which one you want to do first. This one?
Well,
all right.
I would write on there, believed to be Michael, how should I say this? Michael Fritz. Michael Fritz. And Catherine, the mother's name was Catherine Harsch, H-A-R-S-C-H was her family name. And this picture could have been taken about 1870, what did we decide that was? 1874. My grandma, I think, was born 1876. Parents to Emilia Beck. This is supposed to be the same woman, Catherine. It's on here. Catherine Fritz. Can you take them at the same time? Mm-hmm. And his name is also, is it John Michael? His name is also Michael Fritz, like his father. And his wife and his son, Christ. And that one on top, I'm not sure of.
Can you tell me about these pictures?
That's me and my two brothers. One is older than I am and the other is younger. And that had to be about 1929. And this picture was a little earlier. Those are my parents and my older brother and I.
Can you tell me about your siblings when you were growing up?
Well, I said to my older brother the other day, I think he and I should go out to catch gophers and pick mayflowers because that's what we used to do. There were times when the county paid a bounty. You saved the gopher tail and you got a penny for it. So that was that didn't always work, but some years it did. So that's what we did. And the pasque flowers, which are called mayflowers, they bloomed on all the hillsides, and of course we walked to our grandparents, and we had chores too. As soon as we could handle that, we had to feed the chickens and bring the cows home to milk and feed the calves and things like that, and wash the dishes and set the table and help plant potatoes and help pick up potatoes when they were grown. And as soon as my brother was old enough, I don't really know how old he was, not very old, he had to drive the header box. You don't know what a header box is probably, but you know, you had a header box and the header cut the wheat off and brought it up on the header box, and the boys had to do that when they were really young. I didn't have to do that. But when I was about 12, 13, 14, they really expected a lot of you. By that time I had 2 little brothers, and my mother would go out in the field and I would get lunch ready. We had canned meat and we had canned vegetables like corn and peas and stuff, and the potatoes were in the cellar, and you put some of that meat in the pan and heated it up, and you boiled some potatoes, and that was our noon meal. You know, that really wasn't very, not too much fat and stuff in it. It was a good meal. All the potatoes were homegrown, and then I had to take care of my little brothers. And when Delbert was 2, I think he was not quite 3, and then Gordon was born, and he was the only one that was born in the hospital. So my mother went to the hospital, and I had gone to high school one year, but then she was going to have this baby in October, and I had to stay home that year. And when she was in the hospital, there was my dad and my brother Gideon, who was older, my brother Marvin, who was a little younger than I, and Delbert, who was 2. And I cooked for all of them and kept house. I was 14. And the only help I had was when I had to do the laundry. One of my aunts came. But I did all the cooking and the cleaning, and they expected a lot of you. This is a picture of how my dad's farm looked way back in the 30s. And then later on they built this entry on the house, and they always made improvements. This picture shows how they were fixing the windmill. This was a picture of a spring storm. That's a garage over there. And that's my brother Gideon, and that's my brother Marvin holding Gordon. And these are my 2 little brothers, and here is Marvin sitting on the hood of the 28 Chevy. Here is a few pictures you should see. Take that one away. These are really oldies.
Can you tell us about them?
Okay, the one on top is my Aunt Esther and my brother Gideon. And this one is my brother Gideon and me. And this is my Aunt Elma and me and my brother Gideon. And this is my brother Gideon and my brother Marvin and me. And this is me and my brother Gideon, and that was at my grandpa's farm. And that's my brother Gideon and me. I don't remember whose house that was. And that's me and my two brothers, and that was at my Grandpa Beck's house. And this is how our house looked at the beginning, when I was a baby. And on the side of that car are two people, and one of them is me. That's how our schoolhouse looked, and those were all the pupils.
Did you go to a one-room schoolhouse?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about your schoolhouse?
It was just a big square building. It was in pretty good shape at that time, and with a round pot-bellied stove on one side. And if it was cold, we played games indoors at noon hour, and if it was nice, we went outside, and in spring we played softball and other games. And here are my parents, and this lady right here was my teacher. And the rest of them are kids from our family and one of the neighbor families. I think that's enough pictures.